At least one of the nightmare scenarios did not come to pass. There has been no attempt by one of the candidates to deny the result of the 2024 US presidential election, no threat from his supporters to overturn it by force. There didn't need to be. This election was as close to a complete triumph for President-elect Donald Trump as he might have dared imagine. He won the Electoral College handily and, for the first time in 3 attempts, is on track to win the popular vote. He beat Vice President Kamala Harris across her so-called blue wall of Midwest and Rust Belt states and expanded his coalition of voters, even including significant numbers among cohorts, notably Latinos and women, he had specifically promised to persecute. Trump's Republican Party, and it is now more than ever his Republican Party, won control of the Senate and as of this broadcast have a decent shot at capturing the House of Representatives. The US Supreme Court is pre-stacked with sympathetic judges who have already decided that he is effectively above the law while in office, despite his already lengthy rap sheet of criminal convictions and pending further charges. The consequences will not be confined to the United States. The consequences of US presidential elections never are. The weeks before Trump is inaugurated and the years after will be anxious ones for those countries accustomed to America's friendship and support. Why have American voters re-elected Donald Trump, despite what might appear a long and persuasive list of reasons not to? How much weirder will his second term be than the first? And what does everyone else do now? This is the Foreign Desk.
Many people have told me that God spared my life for a reason. And that reason was to save our country and to restore America to greatness. This will truly be the golden age of America.
The struggle for the soul of America has always been an ongoing debate and still vital today. I've said many times, you can't love your country only when you win.
You're going to see a Trump administration from day one be much more organized. Now, he can't do everything all at once. I mean, he can, and there can be chaos, but this is really about clarity of the change that he has promised.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I'm joined first of all from Washington, D.C. by Monocle's senior news editor and producer of this program, Chris Chermak. Chris, welcome to the show. As our listeners will, of course, be aware, you have been broadcasting from Washington, D.C. with our team throughout election week. First of all, just how would you sum the week up from, I guess, the anticipation before Tuesday to the absorption of what the American people had decided?
Well, to be honest, Andrew, in many ways, it was a bit of an anticlimax is kind of what we felt here when you try and sum up the week, I think, because there was so much tension heading into the election on Tuesday, so much energy, whether it was at the rallies that I attended for Trump or Harris. And then, you know, once the election actually hit on Tuesday night, there were all these worries that it would last for days, potentially, the threat of violence, as you alluded to at the top of the program. And then it was just, you know, such an incredibly clear result, and everything was decided by the end of that night. I think that was as much, frankly, the shock as anything else, as the result itself. The fact that it just went off so smoothly, and the fact that, you know, we didn't necessarily, or at least we were talking about a Trump transition and all the normal trappings of what happens after an election pretty much by Wednesday.
Chris, I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't join everyone else alive in indulging the wisdom of hindsight. So if we do that, and if you think back to some of those rallies you attended, perhaps especially the Trump rallies, are there any things which in retrospect seem significant to you?
Absolutely. So I will happily engage in the hindsight that we all engage in. The one thing I tell myself, having gone to both a Trump rally and a Kamala Harris rally, is, anecdotally at least, the energy was different and in those moments. The Kamala Harris rally on the ellipse of Washington, there was more of a nervous energy among the crowd, not to mention protests from pro-Palestinians. The Donald Trump rally was filled with energy. The other thing I would say, being around Washington, D.C., but also getting out a little bit from the country, you see the difference, right? You see how many Trump supporters there were once you get out of certain bubbles. And the main thing that I think that taught me is that Democrats simply assumed that their bubble, if you will, was larger. They didn't necessarily put the work in to reach out to the other side. There was, I think, this assumption that if they simply get their base out, if they get those quote unquote normal people out, reasonable people out who reject Donald Trump, that would be enough. There was not an attempt to cross into that alternate reality, if you will, of Trump supporters and those inclined to maybe support him in order to bring them across. Instead, they assumed that it was Donald Trump who was doing the alienating, who was shrinking his base. And meanwhile, I would argue in many ways, Democrats were the ones doing the alienating by not wanting to work with those people who were potentially supporting Donald Trump. And I have a couple of clips to play for you that I think illustrate that point. And it starts with Danica Patrick. She was at the rally on Sunday in Pennsylvania that I went to in Lidditz, Pennsylvania. She's a NASCAR driver, famous, the first woman NASCAR driver. And she spoke about how, well, we hear two clips, one from her and one from a voter, about why they were there and why they're voting for Trump.
I went to an event in December that changed everything for me. It was called AmFest. Amazing speakers. It was a great time. And I posted some pictures afterwards, and I said, I love this country. And it got backlash. And it was because of that I thought, man, that's not the country that I want to live in. I want to live in a country where I can say I love this country and I'm not making a political stand.
This is my 8th or 9th rally since 2016 that I've been to. So I was thinking I would go to this one, wasn't sure. And then I got home last night and she decided that I have to go.
Why did you decide you had to go?
Because I want to see Trump, and it's my first Trump rally.
What started it for you?
He was the anti-candidate back in 2016. He came in and started messing up everybody else's game plans. So I jumped on the bandwagon right off the bat and didn't look back from it. It's just been fun since. Triggering people is the most fun thing that I do every day.
Why the triggering? What is it about the triggering?
It's just seeing how anti-American they are. They're just the standard values of an American that they just don't appreciate anymore. It's just drive by with a flag hanging off the back of my truck, and it makes me laugh when they just get in their Subaru, get all mad and stuff.
So, Andrew, the reason that I picked those two clips is that I think the one voter illustrates just how long this movement has been going since 2016. Donald Trump at his rally talked about the 9 years that it's been, how established the movement is as a result of that, people now bringing their children to see Donald Trump, but also just the fact that someone like that voter talks about enjoying Donald Trump's rhetoric, if you will, the fact that he owns the liberals, the fact that he triggers the liberals. So that is one aspect of the Donald Trump voter. But then you take someone like Danica Patrick, and she, if you will, is somewhat the opposite. She came into politics late. She talks about, a year ago, she never would have imagined she'd be on a stage speaking to Donald Trump supporters. In her case, she was turned off by the reactions of Democrats, of liberals in recent years, the backlash that she got for sort of talking about her love for America. And I think, in other words, the point of that is Donald Trump actually did expand his base to some degree, and that's not something a lot of people realize.
Just finally, Chris, though, what those two approaches do have in common there, from what we heard from Danica Patrick, the former racing driver, and the Trump voter you spoke to, there's still a chip on the shoulder in both of them. There's still delineating that Trump's appeal is that he upsets other Americans. Do you think that anybody, or did anybody you encountered talk about voting for Trump for positive reasons, because perhaps they genuinely thought he would just make the country great again for everybody?
That's a good question, Andrew. I think, yes, I think there were those who actually believe that Donald Trump will make things better. I think maybe one aspect there, if you will, that is not talked about that much is the fact that Elon Musk joined, because this kind of went back to the original reason for voting for Donald Trump in 2016, that he was the businessman, that he was not the politician, that he would be the one who would be able to fix things, as he puts it at his rallies this time around. And Elon Musk joining kind of cemented that point for a lot of people that I spoke to. The fact that, now you had these two businessmen who would be coming in and be able to fix America. So I think that was kind of the biggest thing I would say when I spoke to some Trump voters in terms of the positives and why they believed not only that it was about the rhetoric and, the liberals' reaction to the Trump rhetoric, but why they believe that Donald Trump might actually be able to fix this country.
Chris Chermak in Washington, D.C., thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio with me, Andrew Mueller, and I am joined now by Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic and author of, amongst others, and depressingly germane to today's deliberations, Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. Tom, welcome back to The Foreign Desk. I guess the big question that everybody is interested in is how much weirder is this going to be than the first time round?
I think it's going to be pretty weird, although it's going to be less weird but more alarming in the sense that there will be less flailing around. The Trump team learned a lot of lessons the first time around. So this time they're probably going to avoid some of the odd stuff going on. I mean, he's got a chief of staff who, seems to have some control over him, for example, already. I think it's going to be excessively weird in the sense that, in the first term, he ran almost like a prank that got out of control. Mm. This term, he ran specifically to stay out of jail. So, you now have a president that once again, I think he took a kind of a Hail Mary pass at staying out of jail. And somehow, again, the voters kind of weren't in on it. And just believed him when he said he wanted to make America great again. Although I have to say, Andrew, I was less shocked this time than I was the first time. I mean, after the first time, you knew it was possible. Let's put it that way.
I do want to come back to that question of his appeal despite everything, but if we focus on the prospects of the administration, one thing that does seem will be different is that there will be a lot less what we might think of as orthodox people associated with it. The first time round, quite a lot of his early picks, at least, were the kind of people you could more or less imagine any Republican president putting in senior positions in government. If those people aren't there this time, can we, I guess, invest any hope in the fact that the people who are there just won't actually have the necessary competence to actually get anything done?
Yeah, it's a strange, I think it was the Wall Street Journal. There was an American publication that basically said, don't worry about him. He's too stupid to pull off any of this stuff that he's talked about. That's a hell of a gamble to say that, it's okay to vote for him because you'll get the judges you want and some basic outlines of policy you want, and the rest of it, they'll just be too stupid and incompetent to pull it off. I don't think that's quite true. My colleague David Frum always had this great line about this time the velociraptors have learned how to open the doors. But with that said, you are going to get a lot of people who are just not very competent, who don't have a lot of experience, and who also are opportunists who are going to be carrying their own agendas, their own personal agendas into this for themselves. So I suppose if we'd all like to cling to that reed of hope, that this is going to be a kind of clown car that isn't going to be very good at getting things done, there's that possibility. But I also think that, chaos is not good in a superpower.
I mean, a thing we do have to reckon with at this point, surely, is that this is not a passing fad. 2016, you're right, it seemed like it could have been a fluke, especially more so when he ran again in 2020, tried to get re-elected and lost. But Do we now have to reckon with the idea that Trumpism is a more or less permanent factor in American life which may outlast Trump?
Yeah, I think that the change in American life that I find dispiriting and, so kind of soul crushing is not that Trumpism has become a thing. It's because, Trump is not ideologically coherent. We've learned that for sure. This time around, the first time around, it was I'm going to repeal Obamacare. Now I'm not going to touch Obamacare. I'm going to save Medicare and Social Security. I mean, it's sort of straight up, old school populist homebrew. I think what's changed is that millions of people really have said point blank that they are now as transactional as Donald Trump is. That Americans who once had pitched arguments about the importance of character in our presidents, and even when we breached that rule, when we would have arguments about Richard Nixon or Bill Clinton, we insisted on the importance of character. And I think you now have millions of Americans saying, hey, anytime eggs are too expensive, I don't really give a damn about character. And that is really disturbing to me.
On that thought, though, of the eggs being expensive, how concerned do you think Trump should be, and perhaps how concerned should everybody else be when it turns out that he's been president for, let's say, a year or 18 months and nobody's groceries are cheaper?
The problem is that, again, the kind of folks that, and I've spent some time talking to Trump voters, they're so detached from reality and they are so armed with rationalizations that they will find a way to explain their way out of it. The deep state and the bureaucracy and the regulators and the administrative opposition. And, this is why the answer is to give more power to Donald Trump. I mean, it is galling, I think, for those of us who saw this coming, that Donald Trump is going to inherit probably the best economy in the Western world right now. And he will change his tune in January about how great the economy is the minute he's sitting in the Oval Office. You're already seeing that, by the way, Democrats and Republicans, and this shows the kind of problem that I, been warning about with people getting so detached from reality. The day after the election, 2 days after the election, consumer confidence among Democrats and Republicans flipped. Republicans think, the economy is going to be great. Well, Democrats think the economy, they have no confidence in the economy. The economy isn't, as you know, the economy doesn't work that way. It's not a little speedboat where you can fight over the steering wheel and turn it around in circles. It's a battleship that sort of proceeds at very slow and stately paces. But he will take credit for it. And when things do go wrong, as inevitably they will, one of the things that the Trump campaign and Trump as a president were always good at is blame shifting. Remember, this is the president whose most famous utterances is, "I take no responsibility at all."
That thought, though, about the parallel universe in which many millions of Americans live. I mean, this is not a necessarily entirely new development. If we think back 16 years, for example, there was a definite non-zero number of Americans who believed that Barack Obama was a Muslim revolutionary communist who'd been born in Kenya. And I tried myself once or twice to sort of inquire of a few people how they had come to that point of view and how they could possibly defend it. And you're right, they can always come up with a rationalization. But have we learnt anything during, let's say, the 21st century iteration of manias of this sort about how to push back against it? Is the only way that anybody can learn, does it have to be the hard way?
Well, I've been saying that for a long time. I mean, the only thing I think that's going to change this is some hot stove therapy. Keep touching the hot stove. Because one way that Donald Trump was able to return to office is that millions of people memory hold everything that happened 8 years ago. I mean, it's really remarkable that because I've had these conversations. I had someone tell me, well, don't worry about the tariffs. He can't really do that. He can't really put those through. And I said, that already happened. He's done that. he had to bail out farmers. He had to bail out small businesses. He started a trade flap with China, and a lot of Americans went broke. And you get people kind of shaking their heads saying, "I don't remember that," or I'm not thinking about that." I think the kind of thing you're referring to 16 years ago, Andrew, they're all of a piece with what's happening now. Because even then, Donald Trump was central to that whole thing, and Fox News and the right-wing media system. I mean, this has been, I would say that the American political environment has been, full of this kind of hallucinatory stuff for about 15 or 20 years, tops. I mean, I tried to explain to a younger voter the other day that there was once a time that Americans just didn't vote this way because, of course, people say it's always been this way. It really hasn't always been this way. Bill Clinton had to fight for his life in 1992 to become president because he'd had affairs. How quaint that seems now.
Tom, just finally, the Democratic Party has, of course, assembled itself into the circular firing squad that political parties often do when they've lost an election they expected to win. They will, in due course, start thinking of the future. In the, I'm going to say, admittedly unlikely event they came to you and asked how they could win in 2028, what would you tell them?
Well, the first thing I'd tell them is, of course, as many of your listeners may know, I'm a former Republican. So, the odds that they would ask me anything. But the first thing I would say is, take a lesson from your opponents and stop assembling circular firing squads, for one thing, because, the Democrats have a much more fractious coalition to hold together. But stop worrying about shoring up your left wing, because that did cause problems this time around. Although I did say on both in pieces I've written and on social media, the Democrats shouldn't be too hard on themselves. I think that the headwinds that existed, Biden wasn't going to win, Harris wasn't going to win, some new Democrat wasn't going to win, populist Democrats like Sherrod Brown lost in Ohio. And yet, for all of that talk, it's important to remind people that although Trump won those swing states, so did Democratic Senate candidates. People split their tickets, which is something that I think is, even though Trump was a beneficiary of it, I think more ticket splitting is actually good for Americans, because that's a healthier way to approach voting. So the other thing I would say to them is, you're going to have to learn how to talk to working class voters in a way that is going to make more sense to them. But it's very hard to talk to voters, who say, I'm very unhappy with full employment and low inflation. And so the problem is that the culture war stuff creeps in, and this is where the Democrats do have an Achilles heel. Trump, to their surprise, ran millions of dollars about trans issues of ads, millions of dollars of ads, and they had an effect. Finding a candidate who can, win Pennsylvania and Wisconsin is going to be difficult, but not impossible. And it's not, I guess this is the last thing I would say to Democrats, it's not impure or dirty to think about how to compromise in order to win elections.
Tom Nichols, thanks as always for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. Tom's book, Our Own Worst Enemy, is available now. You're back with The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio with me, Andrew Mueller, and I'm joined finally from the United States by somewhere near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, specifically by Heather Conley, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs and Senior Advisor to the German Marshall Fund, and here in our London studio by Julie Norman, Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at UCL, Co-Director of the UCL Centre on US Politics. Julie, I'll start with you first. Thinking back to Tuesday night UK time, if you can bear to, what was the moment at which you kind of realised this probably, at least for Kamala Harris, is not going to happen?
I think all of us who were watching, you got that sense very quickly, not only with the states that were coming in, but the size of Trump's lead in these states, and especially when Georgia went, when we saw the Pennsylvania count coming through, when those two key swing states were looking very much like they were going to Trump and they were confirmed for Trump, that pretty much sealed it for me. There were still pathways, but that's when it looked like this is going to happen, and it's probably going to happen fast, and it's probably going to happen big.
Well, let's bring you in, Heather, because what we want to do in this part of the program is try to figure out what on earth is going to happen next, both to the United States and the wider world. And what is different this time is obviously that this is a huge mandate for Donald Trump that he did not have last time. Not only does he have the White House, he has the popular vote and the Electoral College, he has the Senate, he may well have the House of Representatives, he has a pre-stacked Supreme Court which has already written him a more or less blank check to do whatever he likes as long as he's president. When we think about the United States in particular, what do you anticipate that he is actually going to do with all of that?
Yeah, I mean, this election was about change and leadership. That's what was coming clearly out through the polling, what was important. And I think you're going to see both. You're going to see a Trump administration from day one be much more organized and will implement many of the things that Mr. Trump has told us. Now, whether he can execute all of that and how, he can't do everything all at once. I mean, he can, and there can be chaos. But this is really about clarity of the change that he has promised. Now, that's against the backdrop of, Americans like that gridlock. They like that 50 to 50%. It keeps one another in check. They're not going to have that. They're going to see the consequences of the change that they just voted in. What is important to them, what is not important to them. We're going to see if tariffs raise inflation or not. We're going to see how deportations look and how the American people respond to that. We'll see if the judicial system is weaponized against the so-called enemies list, the retribution list. And the American people are really going to have to decide if that's the change they want to continue to see. And, that will come out again in the midterm elections, and whether that pendulum will swing back the other way.
Julie, last time out, for those people who were unenthused by the prospect of President Trump, there was some hope in the fact that he did surround himself, in his first cabinet at least, with one or two obvious exceptions, General Michael Flynn to name one. But other than that, he did surround himself, at least initially, with fairly solid, orthodox, even competent people of the sort that really any Republican president would hire. That's probably not going to happen this time, but is there conversely any hope in that for the non-Trump tendency, in that the people he hires, though they may be terribly loyal to him, might not actually be terribly efficient at making things happen?
Yeah, I think both things can be true. I mean, this time I think we should expect that many of the moderates, the people around Trump last time that did provide some sort of guardrails, are simply not going to be in the administration this time around, either through their own choice or through Trump's rejection of them. People have probably heard some of the names that are being discussed for key cabinet posts include the likes of Elon Musk, RFK Jr., people who would not be usually thought of to be stepping up in a cabinet position. So I think we'll see a very different type of administration this time around. The degree to which these individuals will be effective at putting through the things they want to put through or not, I think is yet to be seen. And as we've said, there will probably be some shifts in the checks and balances that we've known before, with some consolidation in the executive branch. But with that said, I would say, just to remind listeners, within Congress, even if Republicans do take the House as well as the Senate will be, less than a filibuster-proof majority. So there is some resistance there, I guess I can say, to just Trump passing any bill that he wants. There will be some, I think the Senate is where you will see there will be a little bit of a limit anyway to some of the legislation, at least, that can get through.
Heather, we obviously have an entire world trying to figure out now what on earth this means for their particular little pocket of it. And we will come to some specific examples, but in general, is it possible that the world might actually end up being left to its own devices somewhat if what Trump really wants to do is remake the United States in his own image, if that's where he decides to spend that considerable stack of political capital that he has?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what we're going to see is a shift of burden sharing and burden shifting to America's allies. And certainly Europe is going to feel that likely the most acutely. Now, the argument would be the United States has borne too much of that burden for decades. Our allies have been warned repeatedly by bipartisan administrations, but now this is going to take effect. So yes, there'll be burden shifting. At the same time, there's going to be just what we call hyper-transactionalism, hyper-bilateralism. And this is where we may see President Trump's tariff agenda and trying to take advantage of that, mixing with security and defense issues. So I think you'll see an administration that will maximize pain, escalate to de-escalate on the tariffs, as well as putting pressure on our allies to spend more on defense, do more, so the United States can either reposition towards capabilities towards the Indo-Pacific militarily, or continue to not bear the burden that it has in the past.
Because, Julie, when we think about how the United States under Trump might now address various foreign crises, what we do know is that he's not terribly patient about any of them. I'm not even sure he's all that interested in a lot of them. He does say, although he says this about everything, that it's all extremely simple and he can fix it in a day. He has said literally that about Ukraine and Gaza. So if we narrow it down to one of those, Ukraine, which has obviously been a big election issue, how do we see him trying to do that? Is it basically going to be just him saying to Ukraine, tough luck, you can't have any more weapons, you're just going to have to give Russia what it wants?
Yeah, I think Ukraine is where we will see the biggest shift on U.S. foreign policy from the Biden administration to this Trump administration. And Trump has obviously spoken a lot about this deal in a day. The clues that we've had about what that would look like, I would say probably first is a suspension of aid until Ukraine commit to some kind of negotiation process. That's something that has been posited. If there actually is some kind of negotiated settlement put on the table, what we've heard from Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, has been that it would include a land for peace sort of deal, ceding the Donbas, ceding Crimea, other parts of Ukraine for quote unquote peace or stability, as well as stopping any kind of Ukrainian accession to NATO, so essentially guaranteeing neutrality. So those are some of the terms that would likely be put on the table. And again, my sense is his trying to push Ukraine towards that. He would probably use the aid that's already been committed and try and put some suspensions on that. But we'll see when and if he actually does that. But that is what has been hinted at through the campaign.
And Heather, it's very easy to imagine as well that Donald Trump fancies himself as the figure who can succeed in the Middle East, where roughly 3,000 years of diplomacy have failed. We did see during his first term, as part of his ill-disguised grubbing for a Nobel Peace Prize, him launching the Jared Kushner peace plan for the Middle East, which I'm pretty sure would have been renamed the Donald Trump peace plan in a big hurry if it had worked. That plan, to the extent that it was ever viable, is definitely now no longer applicable. So do we have any idea at all about what the Donald Trump peace plan for the Middle East might look like? Will it be the analogue of the Russia idea we've just been describing, whereas he just tells one side they can have what they like and the other side that they'll have to live with it?
Well, it's a great question there. I mean, there's similarities, I think, to the diplomacy or the negotiation for the ending the war in Ukraine and the Middle East. From your example of his first administration, you have to have partners that are interested in that peace. You have to have the two sides who want to come to the table. So to Julie's point, in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin's not interested in a deal other than capitulation by Ukraine. And that is a failure for a U.S. administration, because Russia gets stronger, China gets stronger, Iran gets stronger, North Korea gets stronger. So I think we have to start shaping the conversation and how this is a failure of his administration should Ukraine not be successful because our adversaries gain strength. Again, on the Middle East, so I think this is where so many just misunderstand the continuity of U.S. foreign policy. It was the Abraham Accords that the Biden administration, it served as their key pillar of their Middle East policy. They built it on the Trump administration's policy. So I think you're likely to see, and you're already hearing this very early from voices in the transition, Brian Hook, who'll be the lead transition for the State Department, they are going to likely maximize sanctions against Iran, obviously continue to bear enormous pressure on Iran and continue to, I believe, support Israel in its fight against Iranian proxies, whether that's Hezbollah, Hamas, even the Houthis. But you have to have partners willing to come to that table. And that's, you can't negotiate that in a day. The parties have to come to it themselves. But understanding that, again, you can't separate these theaters. Iran is now, and Russia's transferring technology to Iran to reduce Israel's security. Iranian Shaheeds and drones continue, even just last 24 hours, striking Odessa and Kyiv. China is fueling Russia's war against Ukraine. All of these are interlinked, and we have to deal with that alignment in a much clearer and forceful way than I think the Biden administration did.
Julie, this is a part of the world you know well.
Yeah, I would agree with almost everything that Heather just laid out. And just to add that, Trump, he doesn't like these entanglements, these ideas kind of drawn out war. So he has spoken to wanting to end the war in Gaza. But the terms on which he would be willing or open to Israel ending that, I think, are very different than even a Biden administration, which many were also very critical of. But it could include essentially green lighting a continued occupation in Gaza, even resettlement of Gaza. And moreover, I would say the Kushner plan from 2020 actually is still very much a viable blueprint for what might happen in the West Bank in terms of many in the right-wing elements of Israel's government wanting to largely annex large parts of the West Bank. And I could very much see Trump giving the green light to that. And many of our allies in the region, including Jordan and other actors, are very concerned about that possibility.
Heather, we should also consider the view that Europe should be taking of this. It was said over and over and over and over and over and over again that 2016 should have been a massive wake-up call for Europe. It was certainly said during this campaign by one French minister, their Minister for Europe, ironically, if memory serves, who said that Europe cannot leave its security to the whim of a few thousand voters in Wisconsin every few years, which is a fair point, well made. But do you get the sense that there is any way that Europe can actually keep Donald Trump and keep the United States under Donald Trump on side?
Yeah, I mean, I think your point that we have now heard this over and over again from our European colleagues about needing to do more. They just have to do it. They just have to increase defense spending. They have to do some deep structural economic work to be competitive. They just can't write reports anymore. They have to do that tough work. And this is sort of, and I say this, believing that America's allies are our greatest strength and enhance our security and prosperity. Regardless of who's in the White House, Europe had to do those things. And this is where action now is going to have to speak louder than words. The problem is it is a decade too late. This work should have happened, if you remember, former Secretary of Defense Gates saying in 2011 that, you have to do something now or we are going to leave. So the warning signs before 2014, before Mr. Trump's first election, before 2022, how many warning bells do you get? Now, this is going to be a scramble. And look, I don't say this with any joy. I say this with incredible concern. Europe isn't going to be able, in the time horizon that we see our adversaries taking advantage of this, to build the defense capabilities, to spend the money, because Europe's politics are just like America's politics. They're deeply polarized. We have far right and far left elements that want to seek that peace, want to not to spend the money, have deep economic issues and immigration issues that is changing their electoral processes as well. So they have to take action. Talking about it, holding summits, meetings about it, it's no longer sufficient to meet this critical geopolitical moment.
Julie, we should remind ourselves that Donald Trump is currently only president-elect. Joe Biden remains president until January 20th. Until then, or in that interregnum, is there anything Biden can now do to forestall any of those risks we've been talking about? Could he do something? Would is another question, but could he usefully do something like pull the plug on military aid to Israel? Could he start by loosening the restrictions on what Ukraine can aim American weapons at? Should he start seizing Russian assets and spending the money on Ukraine's defences? I mean, his options, and thanks to the Supreme Court, are more or less limitless rather. But what can he do with them?
Yeah, I mean, you named some of the main policy things that I think many of us will be watching for in these next few weeks. Regarding Ukraine, there's already been building pressure on Biden from many in Europe to greenlight the use of long-range missiles from Ukraine over the border into Russia. That's something that the UK, most of Europe supports. The Biden administration has been reluctant for different reasons, but I think there will be renewed pressure on him to allow for that to get Ukraine into a better negotiating position. For the Middle East, back in October, the administration did issue a sort of warning to Israel that if humanitarian aid and conditions were not improved within 30 days, conveniently till after the election, then there might be some suspension of military aid. The humanitarian situation in North Gaza has not improved since then. It's gotten worse. So I think the question will be as to what regard the administration actually follows through on that conditioning or not. And I would say in terms of the assets, there already has been the seizure of the interest on those assets. I think the move for the assets in particular, I'm not sure if they will make that move or not, but I would say these other two pieces are probably the things that are most on the table for right now for us to see some movement on.
I want to close with some words, perhaps, for those of our listeners who may have retreated to their beds in the early hours of Wednesday morning and are resolved not to come out again for at least another 4 years. Heather, first of all, do you perceive any grounds for optimism, either domestically or internationally, from, well, not so much where we are now, but where we will be from next January?
We're going through an incredible testing time, and we're about to test the values that we are going to either defend and uphold, or they aren't really our values. And that will be internally, domestically. Institutions are going to be tested profoundly. And I think if Donald Trump carries through with what he's telling us, the American people are going to have to decide if that is the way they are going to go. And I think on the foreign policy agenda as well, as much as that is not an enormous area for many Americans, I think we're going to profoundly test some things, and we're going to see what is going to stick and what's not going to stick. And if Mr. Trump starts tearing things down, we need new ideas to build back again after these 4 years. So I think you'll see in next January a profound testing of American ideals and institutions and purpose and value. And we're going to have to take some stock taking of what that means. The question of how much damage is done internally and externally, that's the big question mark for me.
And Julie, what about you? Do you perceive any grounds for optimism?
I would say on the domestic front, the fact that the election itself went very smoothly and unchallenged this time around.
That's probably contingent on the result.
Exactly. And I don't think we should sugarcoat that reason. But at the same time, I think if there were two presidential elections in a row with weeks and months of contestation afterwards, and just the trust and faith in the electoral system was really cracked, I think that would have been very long-term damaging, just even though people are very, many people are disappointed with the result. And internationally, I think Heather kind of alluded to this as well. With the U.S.'s potential, retreat under Trump, there is this moment of opportunity, so to speak, for countries like the UK, for other countries that are, smaller but strong powers to step up in this moment. There's limitations, of course, with military economic capacity and whatnot, but this is a moment, I think, for states, for interstate institutions to start thinking, okay, what can we do differently if this world order is starting to shift and change? Where are the opportunities here? And rather than just wring our hands, what can we do in this moment to start putting things on a better course?
Julie Norman and Heather Conley, thank you both very much for joining us. And that's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Lily Austin. Lily also produced this week's Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email chris@cc@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller. Until next time, goodbye.